Views are probably the easiest part of coldbox to use. A view file is mostly HTML. It's the part of your app that people actually view in their web browser, hence the name. Just like handlers, views follow a naming convention. Over here, we're on the users/list URL, which we know runs the list method in our user CFC handler. And after that, it renders the list.cfm file in our users folder underneath the views folder. You can see that here in the editor. Here's our views folder, users, and there's list.cfm. When I click on one of the links here in the site, it goes to the users/details URL, and it runs the users detail method in the handler. That's a pretty standard pattern in MVC frameworks. If you've ever used another MVC framework before, this will be pretty familiar to you. You've got some sort of convention in the URL, either a pattern that we follow, like we're doing now, or some sort of URL parameter that points to a configuration option that is hooked together somewhere in the framework. In this case, we're using the naming convention thing because coldbox is a convention-based framework. We've got users/details that points to the users handler, and inside there is our details method. After that runs, it then goes to the views folder, looks for the same named folder users, and since we ran the details method, it then loads the details.cfm view. When we were over here on the users/list page, it ran the users list method in the handler CFC, and then it goes to the users list.cfm file and renders that content out to the screen. That's the default behavior, where we're on users/list, that runs the users list method, and then it uses the list.cfm output as the view that we're rendering on the page. You can override the default view and use another one if you want to instead. We'll look at that now. Here's our tabular.cfm view file. We can activate this by going into the users list handler and calling event.setView. I'll do that now. Go to users, here's our list handler, and I'm just going to uncomment this line of code, event.setView. There we go. And when I reload the browser, you'll see our view will go from the list style view that we have here over to a tabular-based layout. Take a look at that code now over here. And you can see this is the view file. It's got the same sort of content in it that our list.cfm view does. Over here you can see we're doing get setting company name. In the tabular one, we're also doing get setting company name. In our list view, we're outputting the content of prc.qry users. In our tabular layout, we're outputting the contents of prc.qry users and just rendering that in table tags instead of in the original layout where we're using an unordered list. All you have to do to make that work is back here in your users handler, is we did event.setView and passed it users/tabular. That's the users folder underneath our view, users. And then /tabular is the name of the view file we're looking at without the .cfm extension tacked onto the end of it there. It's not a coincidence that the variables and pieces of data from our handler are the same in our list view file that they are in the tabular CFM file. Since both of these talk to the same method in our handler, in this case the list function, all the data in here is going to power whichever of those views we're using, either the default one or the tabular.cfm file. So the data that this view expects will be the same data that this view expects. And if I had a third view file that was also used to override the users list output, that would also be expecting the same pieces of data. So for instance, if I had a variable in here in my tabular one doing something like cf outputting prc dot, and then some variable that doesn't actually exist in the user's handler, favorite color, that would throw an error because this variable is not defined in our handler over here. I can define it. I could put something in here, say like prc dot favorite color. And in this case, let's say our tabular layout uses that variable. Our list CFM layout does not have to use it. So you don't have to use every piece of data in your handler. If you've got something that only makes sense in one layout and it doesn't make sense in the other layout, go ahead and do it that way. That's fine. It'd probably be a good idea to sort of keep an eye on that long term. Make sure you're not populating, say, 50 or 60 different pieces of data in here that only get used in one layout and not in the other. If you find you've got I don't know, the data getting too far off in one direction, then it doesn't make sense to have both views hook up to the same handler anymore. Maybe that's a time, maybe that's a sign to take a step back and refactor your output a little bit, or refactor your handler rather. You can also use the event.setView method to turn off the layout entirely. Simply call event.setView and pass no layout equals true as the second argument. Now your view still renders correctly, but the layout part is gone. This can be useful if you have to render partial pages for things like iframes or UI widgets for some kind of CMS engine or other items like that. So I've got no layout equals true here, and since I'm using a named parameter for the second argument, I've also started using a named parameter for the first argument. It's the same as it was in the previous portion of this video. I've just added view equals in front of that argument there, so they're both named. And now when I save that and reload this page in our browser, you can see the content still appears correctly, but none of the layout stuff is there. The site header and footer styling is completely gone. And if I do a view page source, you'll be able to see that there's not even header or footer tags being rendered to the browser here. It's just rendering the contents of that view CFM file itself and nothing else. You can also pick an entirely different layout with the event.setView method. Maybe you've got like a one-off page that needs a separate layout different from the other pages in your site. You can simply use the same event.setView method and pass in layout equals, set it to whatever the new layout file is for that second parameter, and you're all set. And I've got an example of that here on the screen on line 51. You can see I've got layout equals and it's set to new bootstrap. That's just the name of one of the layout files in my layouts folder minus the .cfm extension on the end there. And you can see when I use that and reload my web page, if I go view page source, you can see we're using the new bootstrap version that we talked about in a previous video. I could also go in here and change that to, let's say, plain, which will use the plain.cfm file. And you can see that layout has no CSS information in it whatsoever. There's no CSS files being included. Go back here to the browser and reload that. And you can see it's the same content, but we're now using the plain layout, so there's no styling being applied here. And that's all being done with event.setView. If you've got a view that outputs the exact same thing every time it's called, you can cache the view by using event.setView as well. You'll use code kind of about like what we have here on line 52 through 56. I'm using event.setView and I'm passing the same view equals argument in for the first parameter like we saw earlier, and I'm just setting it to the tabular layout. You could use the default layout in here as well, or whatever other view you want. And then the caching stuff happens here with these two arguments. I simply say cache equals true, and then I specify a cache timeout value. In this case, let the cache last for 60 seconds. There are a few other options for fine-tuning the cache. You can give it like a last access timeout value. You can give the cache a suffix. You can really get in there and get granular with how the cache works for your views. I would recommend start with something basic. Actually, start with make sure your view works properly and make sure it renders out to the screen how it's supposed to. Then once that works, if you notice performance problems in your website in this particular area of your website, then go ahead and come in here and start adding the cache options and fine-tune them as you need to make the site perform as well as possible. There are a few other ways we can render views in coldbox as well, such as using views from a different module and even views outside of your application entirely, items called external views. We'll discuss those in more detail in a later video. We mentioned that if you don't call event.setView directly, coldbox will use a view that's named the exact same way as the handler and action that's running. This is called an implicit view. That's just a fancy phrase for the default. There are a couple of things to keep in mind about implicit views. First, they should always be in lowercase. So to avoid any issues with casing, set up a URL mapping with the explicit rules so case and location can be controlled correctly by your web server. You can handle that in the router CFC config file and maybe in a URL rewrite rule from your web server if you want to do it that way, just to be extra careful. Second, implicit views are the default behavior in coldbox. They will just work without you needing to do anything. However, if you're working in a team environment with multiple developers, it's recommended to explicitly type out the event.setView method in the handlers so it's clear to everyone which code is being used, making your application more self-documented at the same time. And third, if these implicit view rules are just not something you want to deal with at all, you can disable implicit views entirely by going into the coldbox CFC file in your config folder, finding the setting called coldbox implicit views, and set that to false. Don't forget to restart coldbox when you do that so the changes take effect. If you do want to use implicit views, but you'd like more control over the whole case sensitivity part, you can also go into the coldbox CFC file and toggle a setting called coldbox case sensitive implicit views and set that to false. And again, you'll need to restart coldbox for that change to take effect as well. Up until now, we've talked about how when a URL says something like users/details, the first thing that happens is it runs that handler with that same name, and then we go to the view afterward. Let's go back to command box and try another command real quick. Go here to our prompt and do coldbox create view name equals admin/status. Notice how we're not creating a handler here, just the view is getting created. Now if I go to the admin status URL in the browser, you'd think that would throw an error, right? Let's see what happens. Go here to my browser and go to admin/status. And look at that, it actually rendered something. The code runs, even without an event handler. Just to show you that I'm not lying to you, let's go back here to VS Code. Here is our handlers folder, and you can see there is no admin CFC file in there whatsoever. So that's got to be a mistake, right? Well, what happened is coldbox is running what we'd call a virtual event. When we go to a URL that doesn't match up to a handler, but it does match up to a view, coldbox will sort of create an invisible handler for us behind the scenes so that the view will still render properly. And you can see down here in my views folder, it did in fact create an admin folder, and there's our default text from the status.cfm view that's being rendered on the screen. That's useful for when we've got a page in your app that is nothing but static HTML, no RC or PRC variables are used. Rather than writing an empty handler function just to make that part of your page work in coldbox, you can use a virtual event like this. You make the view, and coldbox will ensure that it works even without a handler function. Virtual events are also useful as a way to migrate legacy CFML applications over to coldbox. You can basically copy and paste all of your old legacy code into views, and it should work. Of course, your mileage may vary depending on how complex that legacy code is, but generally this is a good starting point for moving older legacy apps into coldbox fairly quickly. So you've got implicit views, virtual events, custom views you can specify, and much more available to you in coldbox. The default view functionality is probably enough to get you started building most of your coldbox application functionality. You can get more information on this and all of the other features and views at coldbox.ortusbooks.com.